After an abandoned attempt to attack Liverpool and an aborted attempt to land in Scotland, an old converted East Indiaman loaded with a bunch of scrap iron guns, two French minor warships, and a brand new American frigate bore down on an English convoy in the middle of the North Sea. Quite how had things come to this? Well, the rather claptrap East Indiaman was being captained by one John Paul Jones, and he has quite the interesting story that had led up to this confrontation. Jones, you see, although his name might suggest otherwise, was not in fact Welsh. He was in fact a lowland Scot and had grown up in Scotland under the rule of the British Empire. However, he was not the nicest of people by all accounts, running as a smuggler, then crewing on a slaver, and eventually ending up at, fair enough, a fairly young age, in charge of his own brig. At that point, he'd managed to accidentally, or possibly on purpose, kill a man for a relatively minor offence by sentencing a very elderly sailor to flogging. Shortly after that, he faced another mutiny on another ship where he accidentally, quote unquote, at least according to him and not according to anybody else who was present, managed to run the leader of the mutineers through with a sword. This was after the mutiny was sparked, apparently, by his own mistreatment of the crew, especially the lack of pay. This, of course, rather put him at odds with quite a lot of people, including a few port authorities who'd like to have a word with him. Fortunately for him, his elder brother, who had an estate over in what was then called the colonies, died, and John Paul, now taking on the appellation of Jones, discovered that he had a very urgent appointment to go and take up estate management in the 13 colonies. A couple of years later, the American Revolution, or the American War of Independence, depending on what you want to call it, or possibly the English Civil War II Oceanic Boogaloo, actually had begun, and John Paul Jones found himself siding, for somewhat understandable reasons, with the rebels. He would therefore make up part of the initial officer cadre of the US Navy. Although most of these officers were from the northern states, two, one of them being Jones, were from the southern states, and along with the flag of the attempting to be new country was a yellow banner with a rather fetching green snake on it that said, "Don't tread on me." With the nascent US Navy in no shape to actually fight the Royal Navy head-on, they started their operations primarily as commerce raiders, disrupting British trade. In this respect, Jones did relatively well, but for one reason or another his name kept slipping down and down the promotion list. Although granted an early captain's commission, possibly the first in the US Navy, he constantly found himself being overlooked for promotion, with a number of officers with significantly less service time than him being promoted above him. A number of Southern States officers believed that this was basically because he was a Southerner and the US Navy was mostly dominated by crew and officers from the northern states. But on the other hand, that rather vicious temper and, shall we say, lack of people skills that he demonstrated when he'd been operating on the other side of the pond also seemed to be an issue now, and this may explain why he wasn't given a higher rank earlier. This can perhaps be illustrated best by his voyage in 1778. He was given command of the USS Ranger and sent to break through the Royal Navy blockade out into the Atlantic, do a bit of commerce raiding, refit at Brest in France, since the French were obviously always happy to help anybody who was sticking it to the English, and then go and cruise in the Irish Sea and capture some more prizes. He actually managed some fairly spectacular feats, landing in England and briefly capturing a fort at Whitehaven, which was pretty close to where he'd actually been born. So that was all good. Very good PR. I mean, tiny little, in populist terms at least, nation that's trying to rebel against English rule, and one of their officers has gone and captured a fort on English soil, something that even the French struggled to do. So, all good. However, perhaps more relevantly, he'd also managed to find the English sloop Drake, and captured her after a short gun battle. He only lost 2 killed and 7 wounded, whilst Drake lost 42 out of 160 crew, and he brought the prize triumphantly into Brest. So this was all very good stuff. He's captured a warship, he's albeit briefly captured a fort, he's taken a number of prizes. What could possibly be wrong with his ship's management skills? Well, once he actually got into France, things started to go a little bit awry. The Drake, which was under the command of one of his junior officers, decided to sail off on its own, and so Jones was left with the rather embarrassing position of having to chase after his prize along the French coast to capture it a second time, this time from his own prize crew, before he could actually bring it into port. Once he'd actually reached port, 68 members of his crew signed a petition asking that he be relieved of his command, and this included both of his servants. This reflects perhaps that he was not the best person to be put in charge of a large number of men. As a result, he was relieved of command of the Ranger, which was sent back to the USA with some rather badly needed supplies for the American Army, with Jones given the official story that he was required at the French court for diplomatic reasons, despite the fact that, as a captain, it was incredibly unlikely that the French king would actually see him, since outside of Jean Bart, the French king refused to see any naval officer with a rank lower than admiral. However, in the French court, the French ladies of the court generally actually had a lot more influence than the men, and with a few introductions from Dr. Benjamin Franklin, who was the American ambassador there, John Paul Jones proved somewhat more adept at charming the ladies, as more than he had charming the men under his own command at sea. With the capture of the Drake and the brief seizure of the fort at Whitehaven under his belt, he was granted an audience with Louis XVI, and although the king regretted that since John Paul Jones was not a member of the nobility, he could not possibly give him command of a French warship, because all French warships must be captained by a member of the nobility, he did happen to have an old 40-gun East Indiaman lying around. That was a fairly large ship, and since it wasn't an official warship, it would be entirely possible for this to be granted to him as a command. Thus, by February 1779, he had a new ship. Being granted command of a French vessel wasn't exactly unusual for this conflict, since after watching what was effectively an exceptionally long-range civil war with interest, the French had eventually decided to weigh in their traditional activity of fighting the English, and had joined the war in June 1778. Thus, this gesture by the French king was effectively helping out a new, if somewhat junior, ally in the perpetual war with England. As Jones assembled a crew and began to look for an armament, a rather powerful raiding squadron began to assemble around the ship. Its name currently was the Duc d'Arras, but it was soon joined by the new American frigate USS Alliance, the French frigate the Pallas, the French brig the Vengeance, and the cutter Cerf, which was paid for by members of the French court. 2 other privateers, also sponsored by French courtiers, the Monsieur and the Granville, also showed up. This 7-strong squadron actually posed a substantial threat to shipping around the British coast, since there were very few squadrons of warships of this kind of size going around that weren't actual battle units. In order to crew his ship, Jones was faced with a little bit of a quandary, since, just as the French king couldn't possibly give him command of a warship, no self-respecting French sailor would sail under the command of someone who wasn't a noble. And so he went for that most traditional of sources when you're looking for a scratch crew for a naval ship in the Age of Sail, the prisons. He would also rename the ship, since Dr. Franklin was something of a patron of his, and the ship was duly renamed the Bonhomme Richard. Armament was another issue. Whilst he was still searching for crew amongst the various prisons of France, he noticed that although armed with 40 guns, being an ex-merchantman, these guns were 6-pounders, which, for naval combat, were about as effective as throwing rocks. Instead, he managed to scare up 42 guns of significantly heavier firepower, 18-pounders for the lower deck and 12-pounders for the upper deck, thus giving the ship armament on the scale of a fifth-rate or sixth-rate frigate, but with the armament pushing on the edges of a heavy fifth to lower fourth rate in terms of numbers. The only downside to this was that, well, guns are expensive, and without a significant amount of money to pay for them, he found them from the cheapest possible source, specifically a scrap metal yard in the dockyard of Lorient. Including a corps of men and officers who'd stayed loyal to him from his time aboard the Ranger, he now assembled a crew that variously spoke French, Portuguese, Maltese, English, and colonial American, which even at that point were beginning to diverge slightly, along with a number of Irish dialects, and of course the fact that as a Scotsman he had a relatively broad Scots accent, which made the first few days sailing rather interesting until a system of translators could be set up so that everyone could work out what the heck was going on. Then, for reasons unknown, but possibly due to the fact that many of the captains had met Jones and already found him a relatively disagreeable person, the raiding squadron signed a concordat that basically said that once they were out of the harbour roads, they could go and pretty much do whatever they liked if their captains so chose, rather than operating as a single squadron under his command. This was apparently necessary in order to get any of them to leave port at all. Nevertheless, Jones did not despair, and they set sail on the 19th of June 1779. 2 days later, on the 21st of June 1779, they were back in port as USS Alliance, which was captained by a disgraced ex-French naval officer, had managed to run into Bonhomme Richard, and the whole lot had to come back to port for repairs. On the 14th of August, a somewhat muted departure was arranged, and the squadron set sail once more. Aboard the Alliance was one particular passenger, the Marquis de Lafayette, and those of you who know your American Revolutionary history will be fairly familiar with that name. He was understandably rather keen on invading England if possible, and one of the advantages of Jones's rather outsized East Indiaman command was that it had an awful lot of space aboard, and in that space he'd managed to pack 150 French soldiers. And so the plan that they'd devised was to sail up to Liverpool, which was a fairly significant port on the northwest coast of England, and then later on proceed to Leith, a port on the Scottish east coast near Edinburgh, i.e. doing the Spanish Armada route but slightly more successfully and in reverse. The idea was to then land the soldiers at these ports, extract ransoms from the inhabitants, set fire to anything that might be useful to the British war effort, and of course strike a rather public and shaming blow to the British Empire, which would obviously be seen as incapable of protecting its own ports. Unfortunately, Jones's rather obvious lack of people skills came back to bite him again, as with the ships only a week or so out of port on the 23rd of August, as they made their way up the coast of Ireland, an officer and 20 men deserted from the Bonhomme Richard. The Cerf, which was detached to look for a small boat that had become lost in the fog, took the opportunity to desert in whole. The privateer Granville captured a prize, basically put two fingers up at the rest of the squadron and went home. And the other privateer, the Monsieur, had a bit of a falling out, to say the least, with Captain Landais of the USS Alliance, found a prize of its own, and likewise went off to France. So, with 3 of the 7 ships of the squadron having decided that they were just going to up and leave, Jones now faced another issue as USS Alliance's captain, Captain Landais, refused to obey an order from Jones and went off on his own as well. They were back a few days later with a captured ship, and so Jones, rather understandably, decided to call a council aboard his ship for the remaining captains. Landais, however, refused to come aboard, on the grounds that if he and Jones were to meet on land, in his words, we must kill one another. So Landais was somewhat hesitant, for obvious reasons, to come aboard a ship that was full of men who were at least tolerating Jones's command at this point. The Alliance went off to do its own thing again, and that left Jones aboard Bonhomme Richard with only 2 ships out of the original 6 ships that made up the rest of the squadron present, the French frigate Pallas and the French brig Vengeance. the two professional naval officers in charge presumably having watched the entire sequence of events with a degree of bemusement. They did, however, point out that with only 3 ships left, the chances of a successful landing at Liverpool were fairly slim, and so they decided to go for their second objective, the landing near Leith near Edinburgh. And so the 3 ships gamely sailed up the Scottish west coast, round the top of Scotland, and headed down the Scottish east coast. But they were seen entering the Firth of Forth, and soon the hills around the Scottish east coast were blazing with warning fires, combined with a strong west wind that blew the small squadron out to sea. It was fairly clear that there was now little point in trying to land in this area, since by the time the wind died and they were able to sail back towards the coast, the enemy would surely have reinforced the various possible landing areas with cannon and men. So, instead, Jones, in his way, decided that, well, with 2 objectives frustrated, the best thing to do was simply to sail further south towards England proper, where, of course, no one would know he was coming. As the 3 ships made to do this, that by very peculiar chance they ran into the Alliance again, which had apparently had similar thoughts about its area of operations and had likewise gone all the way around the British Isles. Landais had calmed down slightly, and Jones was able to arrange a rendezvous with him off Flamborough Head, a promontory on the coast of Yorkshire, which points out into the North Sea. As the now 4-strong squadron began to meet up, they sighted another group of ships near Flamborough Head, a convoy of 40 merchantmen escorted by 2 warships. The rather powerful new 44-gun frigate HMS Serapis, commanded by Captain Richard Pearson, and the somewhat more diminutive hired sloop the Countess of Scarborough, which was armed with 20 guns, but only 6-pounders, being, as similarly to Bonhomme Richard's original incarnation, a commissioned merchantman, only one that hadn't raided a scrapyard, and this one was under Captain Piercy. The British warships did have the advantage of having the wind of the raiders, and so steered between the convoy and the 4 unknown ships in order to protect the convoy if the ships turned out to be hostile. On paper, the Franco-American squadron held a considerable advantage, with any one of their ships, even including the Vengeance, which, was, as I said before, was only a small brig, theoretically outgunning the Countess of Scarborough, which would leave 3 ships, including 2 frigates, the Pallas and the Alliance, as well as the somewhat odd arrangement of the Bonhomme Richard, able to face off against the Serapis, which, although it outgunned any one of the ships individually, could not possibly stand up to a concentrated train barrage from all 3. Of course, Captain Pearson of the Serapis had a look over at the enemy squadron, particularly with an interest with the odd-looking ex-Indiaman in the midst of it, and he was fairly confident that he could at least protect the convoy, even if he couldn't win a battle. Of course, he didn't know about the rather large troop contingent aboard the Bonhomme Richard, but nevertheless he configured both his ship and the Countess of Scarborough to face off against the enemy squadron. Jones, realizing the simple mathematics of the situation, ordered a line of battle so that his squadron would attack together and overwhelm the Royal Navy ships in fairly short order. Unfortunately, it seems that every other captain in his squadron had their own ideas and decided to do their own thing instead. In the confusion, the British managed to tack ahead of the Americans, which meant that they had directly interposed themselves between the squadron and the mass of merchant ships that they were actually covering. And so, with all sides beating to quarters, which is to go to action stations in the old parlance, and by about 7 o'clock in the evening, the 2 units had begun to close to gunshot range. Of course, the identity of this newly arrived squadron was still unknown to the Royal Navy, although they presumed them to be hostile and they were making hostile actions. Whether they were privateers, Americans, French, or somebody else that the Royal Navy happened to be at war with at the time was still up for grabs. To be honest, they could very well just be English-sponsored privateers who'd picked the wrong target by accident. And so they were still in the process of challenging one another when Captain Pearson threatened the Bonhomme Richard, saying that if she didn't declare herself for the last time, he would fire upon her. Jones decided that the correct response to this challenge was a broadside of his own, and so the unusually heavily armed East Indiaman opened up with a broadside that would prove absolutely devastating for John Paul Jones. There was a reason that those cannons had been in a scrapyard. 2 of the 18-pounders on the lower deck detonated immediately upon the first shot being fired. Lieutenant Mariant, the commanding officer of the lower gun deck, made an unexpected appearance near Jones as the explosion blew a hole in Bonhomme Richard's deck and catapulted the unfortunate officer up through it to deposit him on the upper deck of the ship. Along with a number of other men wounded by the blasts, he was carried below again in order to treat his wounds and his temporary blindness. In return, the Serapis unleashed its own broadside, which was decidedly more disciplined and involved considerably fewer explosions on behalf of its own guns. With the ship significantly more capable in terms of speed and agility as compared to the ex-East Indiaman, the Serapis simply unleashed a full broadside into the ship, then pulled ahead out of the arc of the Bonhomme Richard's gunfire, reloaded, dropped sail, came back in, and fired another broadside, and then proceeded to rinse and repeat this process for the next half hour or so. The Alliance was a bit too far away to help, and the other frigate present in the squadron, the Pallas, had decided it was much easier to fight the Duchess of Scarborough, and was proceeding to batter that into submission. Captain Piercy aboard the Duchess of Scarborough put up a fairly good defence against the significantly more powerful French frigate, but was eventually forced to strike his colours. But that particular conflict kept the Pallas from helping Jones, as once the colours had been struck, rather than heading off to assist his ostensible commanding officer, the captain of the French frigate decided to spend the rest of the night making the prize secure. You might ask where the brig Vengeance was, and, well, pretty much everybody was asking where the brig Vengeance was, because it had decided apparently that it was going to sit this one out and take a spectator mode. Life aboard the Bonhomme Richard, on the other hand, was far from spectator mode. The Serapis was firing solid shot from its lower guns and canister shot from its upper guns. The Bonhomme Richard had not been the world's newest ship when it had commissioned, and the voyage around the UK had done it no favours. The solid shot and canister were tearing the ship's hull apart and doing a fairly good job of reducing much of the crew to dismembered limbs and red mist. The French infantry were particularly badly affected, as they'd gathered on the quarterdeck ready for a boarding action and then were now being cut down like wheat. Jones, realising their morale was wavering, seized a musket from one of them and fired at the British vessel, then grabbed another loaded musket and repeated the process another half-dozen times to encourage everybody. However, that didn't really help matters, as Serapis came in again and delivered another broadside, dismounting another gun and killing or wounding another 19 men, with a number of other gun carriages badly damaged as they were shot apart by incoming fire. Within half an hour of the battle beginning, at Jones's own order, the Bonhomme Richard had a grand total of 3 of its 42 guns left operational, and one of those was being operated by Jones and a scratch crew of survivors from the other guns. The British were not having it entirely their own way, though. Whilst the Serapis's guns were having a considerable destructive effect on the lower gun decks and wreaking a lot of execution on the ship's main and quarter decks, a lot of Bonhomme Richard's crew, upon seeing their own method of fighting back either explode, fail, or get knocked off its carriage by incoming fire, had decided discretion was the greater part of valour and scrambled up the rigging. Unlike French ships, which tended to aim for the rigging, the British were more interested in gutting the ship's hull, and so a significant number of crew that survived the broadsides that had sent their guns into inoperable status had now fetched up amongst the rigging relatively safe and sound, and were pouring in musket fire and various other forms of projectiles onto the open decks of the British frigate. As a result, it was almost impossible to keep a man at the wheel of the Serapis for any considerable portion of time before he was shot down, and many of the men that were handling the ship's sails and rigging up in the masts were also being picked off. This was progressively making the British frigate harder and harder to handle. This, however, was small comfort to Jones, as Bonhomme Richard was holed all along the waterline, with plenty of water pouring into the deeper parts of her hull, and considerable portions of the hull that weren't already underwater were on fire. Seeing that there was really only one option left open to him, he went over to where Lieutenant Richard Dale was reorganising what was left of the gun crews who hadn't skedaddled up the rigging, and told them to take up small arms for boarding. He then proceeded back up to the quarterdeck to try and steer the crippled ship towards the enemy. It was at this point that the USS Alliance showed up, and everyone thought, "Oh right, okay, finally shown up to help. This is nice." Unfortunately, this turned out to be not so much the case, as the frigate passed astern of Bonhomme Richard, ostensibly on its way to the Serapis, and then opened fire at the Bonhomme Richard, and to be perfectly honest, more specifically, it seems at John Paul Jones. The only saving grace was that the Alliance's crew was so terribly trained that what they mostly did was churn up the water around the Bonhomme Richard, with only a few shots actually hitting home, albeit that this did kill 2 men and, more critically, disable the ship's rudder. The Pallas, meanwhile, was still occupied with securing the Duchess of Scarborough, and the Alliance decided that, having shot up its own commanding officer, the next best thing was to head over to this engagement and commence firing at both the French frigate and the prize. So, yes, the Alliance was probably doing more for the English cause than it was for the American or French. The Serapis, of course, took advantage of this little distraction to continue fire on the Bonhomme Richard, and the ship began to rather noticeably settle in the water. There were a number of British prisoners in the hold from various small merchant ships that had been taken during the voyage of the squadron, and they were now released from their confinement in the rapidly flooding lower sections of the ship. But Jones, rather than allowing them to retake the ship, which they probably could considering the numbers of American sailors left, instead ordered them to man the pumps, since if they didn't, well, the ship would go down and then it wouldn't matter who was in charge. The prisoners apparently realised the sensibleness of this order and very quickly got to manning the pumps in an attempt to keep Bonhomme Richard afloat. With that crisis solved, another one came along. One of the American gunners who'd been knocked out earlier in the fight woke up and saw that the Stars and Stripes had been shot away by British gunfire, and realised fairly obviously that, however slowly, the ship was in fact sinking. His calls that the colours were gone and the ship was sinking were heard across the water by Captain Pearson, who called back to Jones, "Have you struck? Do I understand that you have surrendered?" Jones, who was probably a little bit frazzled at this point, and understandably so, yelled back, "Struck, sir? I have just begun to fight." With what, no one was entirely sure, but it was a good comeback. The spectators to the fight, many of whom had gathered at Flamborough Head, were now treated to the wonderful sight of a battered, sinking, and on-fire ex-Indiaman with no rudder, drifting into contact with a Royal Navy frigate, which had had most of its upper decks cleared by musket fire, and therefore, although theoretically capable of manoeuvring, was not in fact under any kind of human guidance. As the two ships made contact, an English boarding party was the first to move, leaping aboard Bonhomme Richard. However, with John Paul Jones in the lead, the Americans counterattacked and managed to drive the boarding party back. It would be at this moment, however, that the battle would be decided. Although everything, or at least almost everything, had gone the British ship's way so far, 2 officers, Midshipman Fanning and Lieutenant Gardner, saw that the starboard yardarm overhung the deck of the British frigate. They decided to climb along it, and Gardner carried some grenades. Their target was basically to try and drop these grenades into a small hatch in the deck that led down to the powder magazine, which was obviously being kept open to allow for ammunition supply to the guns. They dropped the first grenade, but it missed, bouncing harmlessly off the deck. They cut a slightly shorter fuse and dropped a second grenade. This also missed. Then, with a third grenade, They crossed their hearts, hoped to die, and dropped this one as well. Luckily for them, it was pretty much a bullseye, dropping straight into the tiny hatch and down to the ready-use ammunition, or more specifically, the ready-use bags of gunpowder. Rather understandably, this set off a catastrophic explosion. The only reason Serapis didn't immediately break in half was, well, with that hatch and a number of other hatches open for action and all the gun ports open, the explosion mostly vented out of these. However, what was in the path between the ready-use charges and those exits was most of the ship's crew. The rather spectacular fireball, therefore, either killed or wounded pretty much the entirety of the gun deck's complement, and those who weren't dead were understandably stunned. This left the Serapis with a few survivors on its main and quarter decks from the raking American fire, and that was about it in terms of complement. The situation on Bonhomme Richard was hardly any better, but as Captain Pearson of the Serapis looked around, he would have seen the French frigate Pallas, which had taken the Duchess of Scarborough, which meant he was now the only surviving British warship with its colours still flying, and would also have seen the Alliance firing on them, although obviously he didn't know the Alliance was firing on literally everybody, mostly on its own side, and so assuming that there were two fairly undamaged enemy frigates still in operation, and his own ship basically almost out of men and with no operational guns, Pearson decided that it was time to give in. The fact that Jones, who had been reduced to a sinking, burning ship with most of its crew left hiding in the rigging, had not given up, probably rather reinforced his assumption and led to the Serapis striking its colours. However, things aren't quite as simple as that, since in the heat and confusion of battle, with gun smoke swirling in all directions, virtually nobody outside of the people on the ship's respective quarterdecks could actually see what was happening, and so the fighting went on for several more minutes of furious hand-to-hand combat, and the occasional survivor on either side loading and firing a gun, since they had no idea that the battle was officially over. It was now about 10:30 in the evening, and the battle had gone on for about 3 hours. Everybody was exhausted, and the British officers quietly offered up their swords to the Americans. Jones, in a rather magnanimous moment, told Pearson that he had fought heroically. There were 49 dead and 106 wounded on the American side, and 62 dead aboard the British frigate. Rather belatedly, the Pallas showed up, and the Alliance finally stopped shooting mostly at its own side. Jones took one look at the situation and promptly began transferring his men, the wounded, and anything valuable aboard the Bonhomme Richard onto the Serapis, which turned out to be a fairly good call, as by the next morning the Bonhomme Richard sank into the North Sea. It was hardly an upgrade, as although Serapis was watertight, there wasn't much else left of her, and so with Alliance, Pallas, Vengeance, and of course the Duchess of Scarborough in tow, the ship limped towards a Dutch port, and then onto a French port once emergency repairs had been completed. Unfortunately for Jones, it turned out the Serapis was so badly damaged, primarily by that magazine explosion, that there was no way to actually bring her back into service economically, and she would be broken up in the port of Lorient. As was traditional, the two British captains, Pearson and Piercy, were court-martialed. Piercy, captain of Duchess of Scarborough, was honourably acquitted, since he'd fought a fairly gallant holding action against a ship many times his firepower, and Pearson, in addition to being acquitted, was knighted, due to the valiance of his action in taking on, well, what the British thought were 3 frigates and a brig with a single frigate. The USS Alliance's somewhat questionable, allegiance being left out of that picture. Factoring into this was the fact that although a converted sloop and a relatively new frigate had been lost, the convoy of 40 merchantmen had been saved, since they'd been able to make their getaway as the warships pounded at each other. And that was basically the purpose of the escort. The British could replace frigates, they couldn't quite so easily replace entire convoys of merchantmen. Upon hearing of the now Sir Pearson being given his award, Jones said, "Should I have the good fortune to fall in with him again, I'll make him a lord." And that concludes this account of the Battle of Flamborough Head, one of the first major actions of the US Navy, and certainly one to be remembered for all sorts of interesting reasons. It's not on very many occasions that a captain goes into battle and comes out sailing the enemy ship because his own has been sunk. Jones himself would go on after the war to serve in the Imperial Russian Navy before winding up back in France, where he would die, and then eventually being returned to the USA in the early 1900s. He would then be reburied in a rather interesting bronze and marble sarcophagus at the Naval Academy Chapel in Annapolis.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.